Hello, and welcome to a Brief History of Celtic. My name is Chris, and in this series I aim to tell the story of Celtic's history in a way that I hope is both accessible and interesting. Each episode will focus on a single season in Celtic's history, from the club's inception up to the present day. The aim of this series isn't to deep dive into every single aspect of Celtic history. There are plenty of other resources out there that will do just that in greater detail than I aim, and there are plenty of people far more qualified than I am to present it to. What this series aims to do is to give an overview of each season, look at the competitions Celtic played in, see how the team fared in those, discuss some of the key people involved, and hopefully give a bit of context for all of that along the way. Anyone whose interest is sufficiently piqued can then go into even more detail on their own, although I'll certainly try to point you in the right direction. This week, as this is the first episode in the series, we start with season 1887-88 and the founding of the new Celtic Football Club. In this first section, we'll take a look at what was happening in the world at the time. July 1st, 1887 saw the beginning of the construction of the iron structure for the Eiffel Tower, following the foundation work that had started in January. On July 26th, 1887, Blackpool FC were founded. On August 12th, 1887, the Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger was born. He would go on to win the Nobel Prize, but is best known for his quantum mechanics thought experiment Schrödinger's cat, which I am not going into in a football series. On November 1st, 1887, the English artist Lawrence Stephen Lowry was born. Famous for his matchstick paintings of industrial life in the northwest of England, he actually has a tenuous link to Celtic. In 1978, 2 years after Lowry's death, the group Brian and Michael released a song in his honour called Matchstick Men and Matchstick Cats and Dogs. If you don't know the song, you'll likely know the melody, as its tune is the Willie Maley song that's still used at Celtic Park today. 1888 was an interesting year in Germany, as in March Wilhelm I died and was replaced by Frederick III as German Emperor and King of Prussia, only for Frederick to die in June and be replaced by Wilhelm II, who ultimately would be the last. Meanwhile, in Scottish football, on February 4th, 1888, Renton beat Cambuslang 6-1 in the Scottish Cup final. That 6-1 scoreline set a record final victory for a cup final that would stand for nearly 70 years and remains to this day, at least of time of recording in 2023, the joint biggest win in a Scottish Cup final. Renton then went on to play English FA Cup winners West Bromwich Albion on May 19th, beating them 4-1 and therefore declaring Renton world champions. It wasn't such good news on the international football stage though. The British Home Championship took place in March 1888, with Scotland beating Wales 5-1 at Hibernian Park in Edinburgh on the 10th. However, a 5-0 defeat a week later at the second Hampden Park, what is now known as Caskin Park, all but handed England the championship. Scotland did thump Ireland 10-2 at Solitude in Belfast, but with England winning all 3 games, it meant that for the first time ever, Scotland didn't win the championship. The previous 4 championships had seen Scotland win 3 outright and share the other with England. However, it's the events of May 1888 that are probably of most interest to this series, and I don't mean the opening of the International Exhibition of Science, Art and Industry in Kelvingrove Park on May 8th, but we're a little ahead of ourselves now. This next section focuses on how the season went for Celtic, but as this is 1887-88, it will be a little different. So let's go back to February 1887. For as much as Renton may have won the 1888 Scottish Cup, it was the 1886-87 Scottish Cup win by Hibernian that really sparked the imagination in spectacular form. The Edinburgh side, following their 2-1 victory over Dumbarton at the second Hampden Park, travelled to the east end of Glasgow to celebrate with the Irish immigrant community that lived there. Hibernian, as the name suggests, had been founded 12 years earlier by Irishmen living in the Cowgate area of Edinburgh, so St Mary's Hall in the Calton was definitely the right place for them to go. Among the people helping Hibernian celebrate their triumph was a Marist brother named Walfrid. Walfrid had already been considering using football as a means to help raise much needed funds to help feed the impoverished children of the East End of Glasgow, where he was a teacher. So when John McFadden, Hibernian's secretary, suggested that the people of the East End of Glasgow should go forth and do likewise, it only served to stoke a fire that was already kindling. It would take a few more months of planning and organising, but on November 6th, 1887, at another meeting in St Mary's Church Hall, the new Celtic Football and Athletic Club was founded. The meeting was chaired by John Glass, Brother Walfrid's right-hand man and later the first committee president of Celtic. The other founding fathers of Celtic at that meeting were Dr John Conway, who had delivered an address at Hibernian's celebrations, James Quillen, John H. McLaughlin, John O'Hara, Hugh Darragh, William McKillop, Joseph Shaughnessy, Joseph Michael Nellis, Joseph Francis McGrory, Michael Cairns, Pat Welsh, James Curtis, James Mackay, Daniel Malloy, John Charles MacDonald, David Meekleham, Francis McErlin, and brother Dorotheus. Announcements of the new club started to appear in various publications following that meeting, and one in particular that was circulated around the parishes in January 1888 made it clear to all the reason for the foundation of the club. Celtic Football and Athletic Club, Celtic Park, Parkhead, corner of Dalmarnock and Janefield Streets. Patrons: His Grace the Archbishop of Glasgow and the clergy of St Mary's, Sacred Heart and St Michael's Missions, and the Principal of Catholic Laymen of the East End. The above club was formed in November 1887 by a number of the Catholics of the East End of the city. The main object is to supply the East End conferences of the St Vincent de Paul Society with funds for the maintenance of the dinner tables of our needy children in the missions of St Mary's, Sacred Heart and St Michael's. Many cases of sheer poverty are left unaided through lack of means. It is therefore with this principal object that we have set afloat the Celtic, and we invite you as one of our ever-ready friends to assist in putting our new park in proper working order for the coming football season. We have already several of the leading Catholic football players of the west of Scotland on our membership list. They have most thoughtfully offered to assist in the good work. We are fully aware that the elite of football players belong to this city and suburbs, and we know that from there we can select a team which will be able to do credit to the Catholics of the west of Scotland as the Hibernians have been doing in the east. Again, there is also the desire to have a large recreation ground where our Catholic young men will be able to enjoy the various sports which will build them up physically, and we feel sure we will have many supporters with us in the laudable object. Celtic Park, around the corner from the current ground, was constructed over the course of the next 6 months. The work was carried out utilising a volunteer workforce to construct a new stadium to the east of the Eastern Necropolis graveyard and to the west of what was called Dalmarnock Street but is today Springfield Road. You'll note the circular referred to the corner of Dalmarnock Street and Janefield Street. The new ground was opened on May 8, 1888, the same day as the aforementioned international exhibition at Kelvin Grove Park, and involved a match between Cowlares and, who else, Hibernian. The game finished goalless in front of a very respectable crowd of 3,000 spectators. 3 weeks later, on May 28, 1888, Celtic played their very first match. The opposition was a fellow Glasgow club called Rangers. More accurately, the opposition was listed as a Rangers Swifts team, which, although supposedly a reserve team, was actually mostly their first team. Celtic's very first line-up that day was goalkeeper Michael Dolan, right back Eddie Pearson, left back James McLaughlin, right half back Willie Maley, centre half back James Kelly, left half back Phil Murray, outside right Neil McCallum, inside right Tom Daly, centre John Madden, inside left Michael Dunbar, and outside right Charlie Gorovin. A standard 2-3-5 formation for those days. The game, played in front of 2,000 spectators, finished 5-2 to Celtic. Outside right Neil McCallum scored the very first goal in Celtic's history, and indeed the first goal at the newly constructed Celtic Park. There is some question over the other Celtic goals. Some report that Tom Maley scored a hat-trick, while it's possible that his brother Willie may have scored one of those three. James Kelly was the other goal scorer for Celtic that day. The Rangers goals both came from Souter, whom some speculate was actually a guest player from another Glasgow club, Partick Thistle. Nevertheless, as the Scottish umpire reported the following day, it would appear as if the newly formed Glasgow club, the Celtic FC, has a bright future before it. The final section of this series aims to focus on a player who played a part in both Celtic history as a whole and also the season in particular. For 1887-88, that really has to be our very first goal scorer. Cornelius Neil McCallum was just 19 years old when he struck that opener against Rangers on May 28, 1888. Prior to scoring that historic goal, Neil had played for Renton in the Scottish Cup final against Cambuslang, and just 9 days before Celtic's first ever match he'd played in the World Championship against West Bromwich Albion. As noted earlier, Renton won those matches 6-1 and 4-1 respectively. Born in Bonhill in July 1868, Neil first signed for Renton in 1885 and played for him for 3 years in total before moving to Celtic, where he not only scored that first goal but also played as Celtic reached their very first final in the Exhibition Cup. Neil also scored as Celtic played in their first Scottish Cup final, something that also came in their very first season. In 1890, Neil played a couple of games for Blackburn Rovers, signing in what was said to be a moment of madness before returning to Celtic in 1891 under amnesty. This was despite him being tempted to join Nottingham Forest. It was a good choice as he went on to help Celtic to win the Scottish Cup for the very first time. In doing so, both Neil and fellow Celtic first 11 player James Kelly became the very first players to win the Scottish Cup with two separate clubs, both having played in Renton's 1888 win. Neil did eventually go on to sign for Nottingham Forest after that Scottish Cup victory, where he played until 1895, with a couple of loans to Loughborough and Newark Town during that time. Neil then moved to Notts County for a year before winding down his career at Hainer and Gravesend. The McCallum name would feature again for Celtic, as Neil's great-nephew Dennis would play for the club in the 1920s. Neil's nephew Charles, Dennis's father, was also a footballer who played for Burnley. Neil played just once for Scotland, scoring a goal in the aforementioned 10-2 win over Ireland in the 1888 home internationals, just a couple of months prior to Celtic's very first match. Interestingly, Neil was actually a guest player for Rangers in February 1888 in a friendly match against Aston Villa, which would make him the very first person to play for both Celtic and Rangers. Neil McCallum died in November 1920 at the age of 52 and was buried in his hometown of Bonhill. The Celtic Graves Society held a ceremony to mark his resting place in January 2012, a recording of which you can find linked from the Celtic Wiki. 1887-88 was the last Scottish football season without Celtic. When it kicked off with the Scottish Cup first round in August 1887, Celtic weren't even a consideration and were still several months from their founding. By the time Renton won the final in February 1888, with two men in the ranks who would go on to be a huge part of Celtic's history, the first Celtic Park was well under construction and the beginnings of the club were well underway. By the time Scottish football's 1888-89 season began, Celtic were ready to hit the ground running. If you want to know more about this particular period of Celtic history, I would highly recommend the book Celtic the Early Years by Brendan Sweeney. There you'll find a great deal more detail on the founding of the club, the people involved, the environment in which the club was founded, and plenty more. I would also recommend you check out the Celtic Wiki online, as it's the best resource for anything Celtic related that you're ever likely to find. It's where I do most of my research after all. I hope you've enjoyed this brief history of Celtic. If you have, please consider liking and subscribing so as not to miss out on future videos. Next time we'll look at season 1888-89. Thanks for watching and hail hail.